Today's episode is a special replay from At the Water's Edge with host Scott Kelly. Full credit to Scott Kelly and At the Water's Edge. Check it out on Spotify and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. I wanted to share this episode because it cuts through the talking points and gets to the ground truth of modern war. What close air support actually looks like when troops are pinned down. Visibility is bad, timelines are brutal, and decisions have consequences. If you care about readiness, joint warfare, or what happens when the capabilities get optimized out of existence, this conversation is worth your time. In this episode, Scott is joined by a heavyweight panel of former Air Force pilots, Tactical Air Control Party veterans, and military scholars to take on one of the most contentious debates in U.S. defense policy. Should the A-10 Warthog be retired? Drawing on combat experience from Iraq and Afghanistan, Pentagon planning, and military history from World War II to Ukraine, they argue that retiring the A-10 isn't about obsolescence. It's about priorities, incentives, and what gets lost when caste culture disappears. You'll hear from Not Just War Stories regulars Steve, Nate, and Conan as they break down what the A-10 was designed to do and why the mission still exists, the difference between dedicated CAS and CAS as a checkbox, why speed, stealth, and altitude don't replace loiter time, visibility, and survivability, the real limits of the F-16 and F-35 in close air support scenarios, why drones and light attack aircraft aren't true A-10 replacements, institutional incentives, budget priorities, and the Air Force-Army divide, and what ground troops lose when caste culture disappears. The bottom line, close air support isn't obsolete, it's been deprioritized, and future wars will still put soldiers in the mud, and they'll still need air support they can trust. Note, this episode has been edited and reposted with permission. All right, here's At the Water's Edge with Scott Kelly on the A-10 retirement debate.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 27th of January, 2026. Let's get started. Now, today's episode is all about one of the most badass pieces of military hardware ever to grace planet Earth, and that is the A-10 Warthog, a beast of an airframe that has protected American ground troops and destroyed America's enemies for almost 60 years now. Just an incredible platform. Affectionately known from the Warthog, it is probably one of the ugliest airframes on planet Earth until you see what it can do. And then it's the most beautiful sight on the planet when you see it overhead. Now, the A-10 has been the subject of a lot of controversy over about the past decade. And it's because of a number of factors, but the Air Force, despite the A-10's stellar reputation with ground troops, wants to retire the airframe. They want to get rid of the entire fleet of aircraft. Here's why they say they want to do it. The Air Force's argument is that the A-10, because it's an older airframe, because of the mission it was designed to do, will not survive in a conflict against a near-peer adversary like Russia, China, etc. So it's been great for the global war on terror. It was great back in the Gulf War. It was great for the Cold War, but it's time for it to go bye-bye because we got to free up room in the budget for the next generation of aircraft, namely F-35, that we're going to use in that near-peer fight the way we imagine it done. Now, the problem with this is that the A-10 is designed to fulfill a very specific mission, close air support. And there are unique characteristics for the aircraft and the flight crews that man and fly and maintain those aircraft that make them suited for close air support that multi-purpose fighters in general and anything that moves super fast just ain't a great fit for. But the Air Force's argument to Congress and the Joint Force is that this is a sacrifice that we all must make. So today we're going to dig into that. We're going to talk about why the Air Force is making this argument. Does it have legs? Does it have wings? And get some perspective on where all this is going and what this matters. So to help break this down, we actually have an incredible group of guests. We got 3 people on the show today. We've got Steve Call, returning guest, former B-52 pilot, long distinguished career in the military, worked at the Pentagon, taught at university. We've got 2 other amazing guests on with us today. We have Nate Bachand and Conan Higgins, both of whom were Tack Pees in the global war on terror and later left the military, went on to get PhDs and get big brain degrees and published books and articles and all that fun stuff. Both of them have spent a lot of time thinking through their lived experience as TACPs in the global war on terror using this airframe, and what does it mean for how we should understand the role of close air support in the joint fight, and what does it mean to retire the A-10 airframe. Now, this is going to have some acronym soup, and there's two real key ones I think you need to know if you don't have any background here before we get into this. One is CAS, and the other one's called TACP. Now, TACP, lovely military acronym, is a tactical air control party. And a tactical air control party is a team of specially trained airmen, Air Force folks, embedded with ground forces, typically Army, Marine, Special Ops, those guys and gals, whose job is to plan, coordinate, and control air power, including close air support, by integrating aircraft, fires, and ground maneuver in real time. And we'll let the actual TACPs discuss more about that. That's what they're here for. And right in there, close air support. That's what we mean by CAS. And what close air support is a specific mission that aircraft perform in the military. Now, if you look at the Air Force, the way it's set up is designed to do a lot of different stuff and has different aircraft for different missions. And the names and terminology have changed over time. But just to give you some basic background, you have close air support as a mission set, dropping bombs in coordination with ground troops. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, that final scene where you have the P-51 Mustang fighter coming in over the top and blows up the German Panzer tank right there at the end, and saves Matt Damon's life, that's close air support. Black Hawk Down, got the little birds coming in and doing gun runs. That can be an example of close air support. Other missions that the Air Force does, though, they have air superiority. Our fighters are going to take out their fighters so we can control the skies and do whatever we want from the air. So just fighter on fighter fighting. That's a different mission set. If you've seen the first Top Gun, that was air superiority. I know it's a Navy movie, but you get the idea. Another mission set is long-range strategic bombing. We're going to send the bombers in to go blow up the factories, World War II style. If you've seen Masters of the Air on Apple TV, that's an example of that. Another one, long-range strategic strike. We're going to go in and take out the one critical target. You've seen the second Top Gun movie, example of that. So as a general idea, there's different mission buckets that the Air Force and, the Navy with its Air Force and the Marine Corps with its Air Force, and then the Army with its own Air Force, because most of the largest Air Forces in the world actually all belong to the different branches of the U.S. military. Fun fact. Different mission sets that what they do fall into. And if you're not familiar with it, that's a good way to think about it. So with that, let's get to a quick word from our colleagues at the Work to Find Network, and then we're going to go straight into our conversation with Steve, Nate, and Conan. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast today. Super excited to have this conversation because nothing makes me happier as an Army guy than to get a bunch of Air Force guys to talk about how it's all about supporting the Army. So thank you for validating my own ego and sense of self-worth by being here. Real quick, I know, Steve, you're a returning guest. Well, we'll go in what appears to be reverse age order, if I can say that without offending anybody.
I don't mind it being mentioned that I'm chronologically enhanced.
Very well done. You've the most experience of anyone in the group.
There you go.
But Nate, if we can start with you, could you please introduce yourself in your own words for the audience?
Yeah, Nate Bachand. I joined the Air Force in 2017 after going to college, played soccer in college, went to a business school, and all my friends were going and getting finance and accounting jobs. And I thought, as I was about to graduate, that seems really lame. And I found out about this, at the time it was called Battlefield Airman thing. And there's, TAC P, CCT, PJ. And, started working out for that. I was coming off a senior year of soccer, cycling a ton, so I was real fit. Wasn't fit in the pool, and I was like, man, these PJ CCTs got to swim a bunch. And I was like, TAC P sounds like the route for me. So I ended up joining TAC P after that, went straight through the pipeline. So I've been at TAC P for just over 8 years. Recently just got out of active duty and joined the Air National Guard. When I went to Korea a few years ago, I was like, man, I'm doing a lot of golf and a lot of controlling. not much else out of there. It's like, I had this passion for history. I'd already got my master's degree in history. So I went ahead and started my PhD. A few years later, I'm writing a dissertation on Air Force close air support of the Army, 1943 to 2003. So big time frame, because I eventually wanted to zoom in on some of the finer aspects of close air support, namely tactical air control party history. So shortly before graduating, I became the Tactical Air Control Party Foundation. I've been doing some writing for them, and I've been doing a lot of interviews and documenting the history of the career field.
That's awesome. And Conan, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I spent 25 years total in the TACP career field. Most of that was downrange, it feels like, but it was about half and half. So I was on active duty. I was in the Air National Guard as well. I had a real job when I was in the Guard. I was a state trooper. I was a city detective for the city of Lakewood in Washington. Worked undercover. Was a SWAT entry team leader. And I was on one of those call-outs. I decided to go to law school, which I did. And I finished law school, and then almost a year later went back to school in England at the University of Liverpool to get an international business law degree. And then I worked overseas for many years in the Middle East, North Africa region, and then quite a bit down into sub-Saharan Africa. Just recently published a book on crisis leadership that takes lessons learned from 25 years of solving problems that other people won't or can't. And during that time, I also completed my PhD in international law and treaty law, none of which really contributes necessarily to talking about the A-10, other than being a big fan of it downrange, huge fan of it when training new guys for its capability to be on station. And usually the guys that are flying it are a little more down to earth. They seem to be less in love with themselves than, say, the guys flying the 16 or the Strike Eagle.
So the least douchey pilots in the Air Force.
What's that?
The least douchey pilots in the Air Force.
Possibly.
The fact that I've got an ex-girlfriend who's a pilot in no way has any bearing on my opinion of Air Force pilots. That's awesome. Steve, welcome back.
Yes, and I would argue that B-52 pilots are at least as less douchey than the fighter pilots. After all, what was the first thing they did when they killed off SAC? They basically, we called it the ethnic cleansing of the B-52 community. We were their mortal enemies. So, but no, I just, if you want me to do a little introduction, or...
Yeah, please. Okay. We have a lot of new listeners after some events last year. So please introduce yourself again for folks who did not hear your last episode.
Sure. I joined the Air Force in 1981, and right away started pilot training. I became a pilot, B-52 pilot. In the course of my flying career, about half of my 20 years was actively flying. The opportunity came along to teach at the Air Force Academy, which is where I first met Conan. He didn't mention he was a Academy cadet for a while.
Yeah, well, for 3 years, it's currently still a 4-year program. But
well, yes.
Those days they weren't.
I'm always reminding him. He took my intro to military history class. Said, "I want to be a military history major. Will you be my advisor?" And I said, "Sure." And so that meant he was over at my house a lot, and home cooked meals, and so I'm always reminding him of how much my daughter still fondly remembers wrestling around on the floor with him when she was about 10 years old. As you can see, she must have been pretty tough because she just whooped him. I'll tell you what.
I think I picked her up over my head with one hand. So.
Anyway, so I got my master's in military history at Nebraska, taught there for a while. They liked what they saw, sent me back to get my PhD. For Scott's sake, I won't mention where, but then I finished out my career as a Tack Pee. Oh, I also worked at the Pentagon in it was called Strategy, Concepts, and Doctrine office. So, I kind of look at my understanding of air-to-ground warfare as I studied it in the classroom. I practiced it in the battles in the halls of the Pentagon. And then I really learned it firsthand at Fort Drum. So Anyway, after I retired from the Air Force, I became a college professor teaching history, fitting a lot of military history in along the way. And then, of course, shortly after retiring, when I found out how many of my buddies up at the 20th ASOS were doing amazing things in Afghanistan and then later Iraq, I wrote about it in a book called Danger Close. So I guess that's, I've retired from my college professor gig and I'm now getting more integrated into what I'm jokingly referring to as my third career, being as helpful to the Tack Pee Foundation and the Tack Pee community and air-to-ground warfare as I can.
Awesome. So, Nate, you wrote a great article over the summer identifying the problem that we're talking about today. And it's about why the Air Force wants to get rid of the A-10. Could you explain for folks who aren't familiar with the military, what is the A-10 airframe? And can you steelman for us the Air Force's argument for why they want to get rid of it?
Yeah, so the A-10 was designed in the 70s. It was designed specifically for the close air support mission. Up to that point, there had never been designed a close air support platform that was purely designed for that mission set. The need came from the experience in three major wars that led up to the mid 70s, right? World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. World War II, you didn't have a purpose-built CAS platform, but we were really lucky in that a platform that was designed for air-to-air missions turned out to be perfect for close air support, right? The P-47 Thunderbolt, it was designed for air-to-air, but it had this air-cooled engine, which made it very survivable when it came to AAA and any sort of incoming fire. It could still fly to an airfield and land, had 850 cal machine guns, and it became known as a tank killer. The Germans had a name for it in World War II called Achtung Jabo, which was essentially a slang for most terrible weapon. You fast forward to Battle of the Bulge, post Battle of the Bulge, and the SS is lynching downed P-47s on sight. Any other pilot, they're treating them like prisoners of war. B-17 pilot, they don't care. They just treat them like a prisoner of war, send them off to a camp. P-47 pilot, they're killing all their friends and they're lynching those guys on sight. That's how terrifying the P-47 was to the Germans. You fast forward to Korea, you have an independent Air Force that's in charge of all air missions, and they don't have any platform that's really working well for close air support. P-47s are all scrapped, but there's some P-51s. So the P-51 comes out of retirement for CAS in Korea. Go to Vietnam. There's no purpose-built aircraft, right? You have a bunch of fast jets that are essentially long-range fighter bombers. They're built with the nuclear mission in mind. They are not low, slow, capable of providing a very competent CAS missions. Yes, they make something work, but making something work is different than excelling at that thing. You also have the invention of the gunship. Again, just a different thing. It's big, slow, not survivable in a high threat environment. So we realized in the 70s, all right, cool, we got the Cold War. We're back to Russia focus. We need something for the Fulda Gap that can survive ground fire. It can fly low and slow, provide awesome close air support. So, a lot of people think that they built the plane around the GAU-8 gun, right? This big 30 cal gun with around the size of your forearm. That's a myth. That's not necessarily true. The concept was all about survivability and the speed at which it's flying at, right? You want a pilot that can look out the window, see the target that the controller on the ground or the air is talking about, and you have this awesome gun that's a huge bonus. It's meant to kill tanks, right? So that's the idea of the A-10. The Air Force, very shortly after, wants to scrap it because it's not seeing a use for it outside of support for the Army, right? They're like, okay, how does this actually serve our needs as the Air Force? An Air Force who has never really lost the idea that it can win a war on its own, right? And you go into Desert Storm and they see Desert Storm as, oh, hey, look at all these things we did so that the Army can just go ahead and win in 100 hours. We won that war without really the need for an army, so why do we need the A-10? So in the 90s, you get another round of wanting to retire the A-10. but the utility is just there. And also, the A-10 proved its value to the Air Force in that fight outside of ground support for the Army. You have SCAR, you have CSAR, you have all these good things that the A-10 can do. Right, so we're talking about retiring it again. Global War on Terror rolls around, and it's the rock star of the Air Force when it comes to the Global War on Terror. Long story short, Global War on Terror is over, and now we're having the same exact conversation that we had in the late 70s, late 80s, mid 90s. We're having it again, but there's enough support out there for the A-10 that Congress has yet to allow the Air Force to retire the platform. Also, there's some smart people in Congress, and I think there's some smart lobbyists, believe it or not, that actually understand the doctrinal ramifications of retiring the A-10, and that the Air Force does not want to prioritize close air support as a mission set. And once you lose the A-10, the Air Force now has an excuse to deprioritize close air support, especially in a high threat environment. Hopefully that answered your question.
It does. Thank you. So, Conan, you've been all over and dealt with scenarios, not just in global war on terror, but all over, or what people think about the global war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan, but you've seen the world globally.
Mm-hmm.
How much is wrong with that train of thought? And how much is this about the platform itself, the A-10, and also just the ability to have a dedicated cadre of pilots trained to do close air support? And I can speak to this from some personal experience. I was in Afghanistan, and halfway through our trip, our close air support mission was initially provided by A-10s, and then it got swapped out for F-16s. And we were told, don't worry, these F-16 pilots have been trained up on close air support. They're ready to go. And I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure there's a pretty PowerPoint somewhere that shows that they were trained up on it. And I'm sure there's a memo signed by commanders. I don't doubt that. But just having dealt with both in really one night, one platform, the next night, the next, it didn't feel the same as a ground force commander.
Yeah, and it's not going to be, right? As a former JTAC who's called in A-10 strikes in both training and combat, we're really talking about an irreplaceable value of a dedicated CAS platform, as Nate said, right? Trying to close that down without replacing it with a dedicated CAS platform just means that you now have a critical gap in air support capability. In anticipation of this very discussion, I put together a little matrix for myself to keep things straight, not just my opinions, but the F-16 has a loiter time textbook of about 45 minutes. I would say that's one is overhead for that time period, but that also represents number two, having to go what we call yo-yo out to the tanker, right? They're coming back and forth. So you do have overhead cover, but one has to keep constantly refueling or they're going to fall out of the sky. The A-10, on the other hand, can be on station for upwards of an hour and a half to 2+ hours, depending on how they're being utilized and what kind of engagements that they're being involved in. So definitely for your ground commander who was used to a plane constantly overhead, just kind of hanging out, checking things out, reporting things to him, flying at a pace where the ground is not a blur. It's going to be a lot different when the F-16 comes on and suddenly is making passes back and forth or has to go super high in order to slow down that wheel overhead so that they can turn and look at the battle space. I think that really, Nate hit it on the head that the A-10, and I do love the story that it was built around the gun. I know that from at least anecdotally that when it fires, the plane retards in forward flight. So that's why they have to have controlled bursts, and you can't just empty the thing. But the A-10 has significantly more armament than an F-16, right? It has, well, first of all, it's got a 30 millimeter GAU-8 Avenger gun, right nose pointing at you, and it carries 1,150 rounds of party mix, right? So that's going to be your armor-piercing incendiary, as well as just armor-piercing, and some HE rounds now and again too, depleted uranium rounds. Whereas the F-16 has a 20 millimeter gun. That stuff bounces off, current generation tanks and armor, and they only carry 500 rounds. So, I became a lawyer so I wouldn't have to do much math, but even I can figure out that 1150 is greater than 500, right? So, and let's talk about, bombs, are more important in some situations. Great. Thanks for bringing that up. Again, on the books, the F-16 can carry 17,000 pounds on 9 pylons, but that doesn't usually happen. Why is that? Well, the F-16s weren't forward deployed in Afghanistan. If you remember, they were coming from somewhere else, which means they had to take off, fly, hit a tanker, come into country, usually flying yo-yo ops while they were hitting a tanker just to stay on station, and then they had to make it back to wherever they took off from. So they're not taking off with a full combat load of 17,000 pounds. The A-10, which was forward deployed, would take off as heavy and fat as possible because they knew that they were going to be in the fight for a long time. That's a fundamental difference in the way people look at the fight to begin with, right? So the F-16 multi-role, the A-10 dedicated for CAS operations, and maybe we can talk about this in a little later, that A-10 also can operate the Sandy or FAC-A, that's Forward Air Control Airborne, and they can be directing the fight. They can be actually getting the ground commanders, directives, target sets, and guidance. And then, it's funny, but the ground commander actually has to fight, right? He's a little busy. So the FAC can go up there. He can rack and stack incoming aircraft, whether that's the B-52 from way off, the B-1, or using ISR assets, the A-10, because of that long loiter time and because of that ability to really capture the battle space without flying over it multiple times, can pass off the ground commander's intent and guidance and pass off target sets, and the F-16 just can't do that. So I don't know if you want me to keep hammering the F-16 for how it's not appropriate for CAS. Given that or nothing, I'll take the F-16. But I can tell you it was almost every time on a training range somewhere that we would make the F-16 pilots feel good, especially if we'd had a new guy who just bunged up the microphone by asking them for a low pass. And when they flew over and they hit their afterburners, we just key the mic so they could hear themselves.
Nice. Well, so one follow-up then, because, I'm told by every time I turn on the TV and I see some Air Force general talking in front of the Congress that, F-35 is going to replace both of these platforms. So, check the block. We're moving on to something else. F-35 is magic. You're not even going to see it there. So doesn't that solve this entire issue that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the F-35, certainly the money that was put into it, people need to support it. But the reality is the Pentagon's own testing shows that's false, right? So more F-35 sorties are needed for the same effect. They have lower ammunition capacity, higher operating costs. And, I'm not giving out anything that's not open source, but the F-35 has about a 36% full mission capable rate and costs about $44,000 an hour to operate, whereas the A-10 it has about a 70% mission capable rate and costs somewhere around $17,000 to $19,000 an hour. On top of that, when they did the testing, and this is kind of important, they didn't conduct high threat tests, which is the whole purpose of having the F-35, and the reason is because the F-35 couldn't do it, right? So the F-35's 25 millimeter gun has accuracy problems. When they were trying to field it operationally, it wouldn't work as advertised, and they had to go back to the drawing board. The tests were designed to favor the F-35, right? Here's our new baby, right? Fat Alice is who we're going to fly with. The A-10 is ugly and old and stupid, and we don't want it anymore. The problem is, and they tried to cheat, right? They used former A-10 pilots who knew the targets, knew how to process, but there were no live ground forces, and it was all simulated environments. So, as I said, the high threat scenarios weren't used in testing, which is the very scenario that the Air Force anticipated in going up against near peer or peer combat. Right, so Russia, China, we're going to have to revert back to the high threat run-ins because there's going to be air defense, there's going to be a savvy enemy, there's going to be potentially a lack of air superiority or even air supremacy on our side. So the F-35 is going to be able to solve all those problems, as you said, but the A-10 still in those tests enabled more attacks than because of their loadout than the typical loadout of the F-35. By the way, if the F-35 had outperformed the A-10 in those tests, you'd have heard about it, right? You'd have seen those results. They'd have been on the front page of every defense publication. And instead, the powers that be, the ubiquitous they, fought to classify them for years, right? And then released a very redacted version only after a lawsuit. So the results, I think, speak for themselves.
Yeah, and I always thought it was funny that we say that the A-10, and we'll go right to you, Steve, right after this, but they say the A-10 is not survivable enough for the environment that ground forces are going to go into, yet the Army's still planning to fly Apache helicopters into them, which just Apache versus A-10, one is inherently mechanically unstable as it flies, and the other one has a titanium tub. But the pilots are still going to fly. It's interesting. But Steve, please bring us home.
Yeah, I wanted to bring sort of the pilot's perspective into this because well, first of all, as I said, I was a B-52 pilot. Let's see. I don't remember a whole lot of air superiority practice sessions. We were a single-use airplane, right? So what's wrong with a single-use airplane? And second of all, the A-10's old. Well, I think the B-52 was smiling down proudly at the baby A-10, as an old daddy, and it's expensive to use. But my biggest argument is something that I call, it just comes down to aerospace physiology 101 or aeronautical physiology 101. There is absolutely no way a swept wing aircraft, and especially given if it's swept wing, it's also going to be a narrow camber. That means the space between the top portion of the wing and the bottom portion of the wing is razor thin. All of that is designed to allow that airplane to go wicked fast, right? Which means it cannot go wicked slow. So the A-10 with its straight, leading edge wing and its high camber, thick between the top edge and the bottom edge, all of that is what allows it, first of all, to fly so slow. And anybody who's been on an airfield and seen an A-10 just doing, touch and goes in what they call the closed pattern, that is, you just lift off and turn as tight as you can to get enough space from the runway so that when you come around to the landing end, you can turn and land safely. I've watched it in amazement. Other airplanes are turning as tight as they can in a constant bank. The A-10 turns 90 degrees, turns 90 degrees, rolls out, gets the offset, turns 90 degrees, to then go downwind. It's an amazingly maneuverable, and I'm sure Conan has seen similar aeronautical antics in combat. Unless an airplane can go that low and that slow and be that maneuverable, it's not going to be a reliable replacement for the A-10. And of course, this brings up the survivability thing, because it can go low and slow because the pilot has a darn good chance of surviving. And even those, you read the story of the A-10 that was hit with a SAM over Baghdad. Yeah. Yep. It's an amazing story. In fact, I was telling it to somebody on Facebook, and they asked, well, how damaged was it? Well, I found a picture of her airplane after she landed. It's like something out of, a B-17 in World War II that managed to make it back home with only half a tail. It's an amazing airplane.
Steve, I mean, one of the things that we keep talking about is the titanium bathtub, and that's great because obviously survivability, it's tough for the plane to fly itself home. The pilot needs to live. But the A-10, something we haven't discussed yet, is it has dual flight controls. And that's what it, and so, they have hydraulic and they have manual, and everything is redundant for that very purpose. It was designed to take up to 23 millimeter ground fire or munitions hitting it. And I think, you may want to reach out to Kim Campbell. She gives keynote speaking on coolness under fire. She's the only person who has landed a plane that badly damaged in the A-10 community, I should say. Again, World War II, B-17s with no tail, still landing, different story. But the F-35 is just not designed to take that kind of hit. It's supposed to be too fast to target. It's got the stealth technology, and it's supposed to be in and out before anybody really understands what's going on. The reality is that's not how fights go a lot of times, and that's not how the F-35 operates.
Well, let me also jump in. I'm glad the way you phrased that. They're in and out before anybody knows what's going on. Well, for a guy on the ground huddled in a foxhole, you hope the pilot overhead knows what's going on. And that's the other side of this. If the enemy doesn't know what's going on, then how can the pilot who is zipping through there know what's going on? That's another thing about the A-10. It was designed to go low and slow so that the pilot could get a good visual, real-time read on what is happening. I can tell you as a pilot, it's very hard. Everybody thinks that you've got an eagle eye view and you can see everything. Well, when you're going 600 miles an hour, 500 feet above the ground, everything's a blur. You're worried about something out in front of you, and so you have to go really, really slow and hang there in the sky to be able to look down and understand what's going on.
Yeah. I remember in the training for Afghanistan, we had sat through a bunch of vignettes as ground force commanders were about to go in. And a majority of the vignettes that we went through as ground force commanders were actually all around dropping ordnance in close proximity to your own troops on the ground, and all the things that could go wrong. And we heard stories about drops on friendly forces from B-1 bombers, from F-16s, from F-15s, but never from an A-10. And I firmly believe that a lot of that is because, as a ground force commander, I can get trained up as much as possible on how to do air-ground integration. I'll get a Tack Pee from 21st STS with me, all these guys. I got a SOTAC on my team, but we're only one half of the equation. And I can control communication on the ground, but once we go to the air, there's another partner in that conversation. And if that partner hasn't lived, breathed, studied, understood how to run those air-to-ground integrations, things get missed in that conversation and bombs land where they're not supposed to. Even in a let's say, like, you're not danger close, you're not actively receiving small arms fire, but you've identified an enemy position, you need it removed. And, the grids get passed and somebody on their knee pad puts it on the wrong page or writes it in the wrong color, and that the wrong coordinates get plugged in. Like, it's all that silly stuff. And if you're not a pilot who's lived and breathed that your entire career, had to pay attention to it, you're just as dangerous to friendly forces as you are to the enemy.
If I could jump in and piggyback on that, obviously what I also bring to the discussion is my deep background in military history. So I've read a lot of accounts of friendly fire episodes from the air. Take, for example, the famous, carpet bombing that made Operation Cobra so effective in 44. When you have to worry about aerodynamics in the equation, again, if you're going fast and you're sweeping on through, then what happened with Operation Cobra was the whole thing was planned to drop the bombs parallel to the front line of troops, and yet, as it turned out, the winds at altitude where that was happening were contrary, so they had to drop their bombs perpendicular to the front line of troops. Well, guess what happened? So if again aerodynamics are part of your equation when you're supporting ground troops, you are not going to always be able to operate in a way that is in the best interest of the ground troops. And again, the A-10 Aerodynamics 101, it can go low and slow, and no matter which way the wind is blowing, it will always be able to orient itself in the proper way for the attack that needs to happen.
Conan, please.
I just wanted to jump in too. I mean, just to pound the F-35 a little longer. When I was talking about how much the F-16 can carry, on the books, ostensibly can carry more than the A-10. Well, the A-10 can carry almost 3 times as much as the F-35. So if I'm an F-35 pilot and I'm going to load out, a lot of those are going to be precision guided or GPS. Why? Because my survivability is better high altitude, using my stealth where they can't find, fix, and shoot me out of the air. Well, the A-10 can carry and does carry routinely things that are more, I guess, friendly to the ground forces. They do carry Mavericks. They carry rocket pods. They carry things that they can use to mark the target more effectively to make sure that they are hitting the right target without dumping a 500, 2,000 pound bomb on it, and then it's kind of too late, right? So there have been times in Afghanistan where, for one is supposed to be the best pilot, right? Two is his wingman and is usually a little junior, but for whatever reason, one couldn't see it. And I'm sure that one owed two some beer when they got home, but two was able to come in, hit it with a rocket, which is, very, low damage, but very visible. And then one could come back in and then it's game on. They're smoking it. F-35s don't do that. And so, you're on the ground, you've been there. Your commander desperately needs to get it across. Well, guess what? Like I said earlier, he's also fighting, he's also communicating, he's also coordinating, and he's trying to get his troops motivated to do what he wants them to do. He's a little task saturated. So if he's not passing the grid properly, or whoever he designates to pass that, or somebody gins up the coordinate and he doesn't check it off, well, if all they have is GPS guided bomb, that's where you get problems, right? Who's checking his math? Now, the guy in the air should be, but if you're up at high altitude, flying at Mach snot, versus the guy who's a little lower, a little slower, and says, "Hey, I'm not seeing it, right? You're telling me about the river. I see a couple rivers. Let me put a rocket down in this open field," and and you don't see the rocket. They're looking at something else, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, without belaboring this point any longer, there are just multiple reasons why the F-35 was promised to be a multi-role fighter that could take over the CAS role, but it doesn't. It just doesn't.
So one thing that the Air Force started talking about doing, which made a lot of sense to me, back when I was in the military, is that they're making the armament like, okay, we need to get rid of the A-10 because it's overkill for what we're actually using it in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's not going to be survivable enough for great power competition. So we're going to find a cheaper alternative to fill that niche CAS role for those environments. And it was I think they called it the Light Attack Program. And they actually got 3 airframes through testing, and some of them started getting sold to Brazil and some other countries. Like they actually developed a turboprop plane with, low and slow rockets, machine guns, essentially a machine gun nest in the sky. And the other cool thing was it was so much lighter than the A-10, you could land it in more places. So you could actually put it out in these remote airfields without a bunch of mechanical support that you couldn't even get the A-10. So it's actually going to fulfill the role better. And then that program died. I mean, some of it got spilled off to Special Operations Command, but essentially the Air Force just punted on it. Nate, wanted to ask you, do you think that was a viable course of action for the Air Force to walk down? Yes or no? And why do you think they punted on it at the end?
So short answer, no. I think, scrapping that decision on scale, I think that was the right decision. I think there is a great role for that aircraft in AFSOC. And I think in small scale engagements, there is a great role for that aircraft, but no, at scale in a large fight, that is just not your solution, right? And one thing I want to talk about here is the mindset, the institutional mindset that the Air Force definitely has and the Army has to an extent. And that mindset is that CAS is defensive, right? Yes, CAS can be defensive. For most of the global war on terror, CAS was defensive. For most of Vietnam, it was defensive. For a huge chunk of Korea, it was. But there's also this very important offensive role in close air support that you see all over World War II. You see it in the mobile phases of Korea. You see it in the big offenses in Vietnam. Most recently, we saw it in the 3rd Infantry Division Thunder runs into Baghdad, right? Where you can get a division from being bogged down to moving tens, if not hundreds of miles in a couple of days with the use of offensive close air support, right? So if you see And specifically in that Thunder Run, you saw full on every A-10 squadron in the country was dedicated to the Third ID Thunder Run. So Third ID is going to go straight down the highway. The A-10s are going to be constantly killing everything in front of Third ID. If they have to fight, they'll move in close, blow through that fight, and keep going into downtown Baghdad. Right. A prop airplane isn't going to be able to carry the firepower that you need for that level of offensive close air support. It's also, right, if you're going to say that the A-10 is not survivable enough, well, your lightweight prop aircraft sure as hell isn't going to be survivable enough, right? So you're introducing the same problems at a greater scale with that sort of program, right? So, the A-10 or the Air Force's answer to an A-10 replacement is a 2030 version of the A-10, right? Whatever that looks like, if you add a stealth capability, if you add a tech package to it. But no, to answer your question, that was not a solution to the problem. And I think it was a good idea to scrap it and give that aircraft over to AFSOC.
Okay. Steve, yes.
If I could piggyback on that, Nate, I'm really glad you brought up that offensive aspect. I had been working as a military historian, as a Pentagon strategist, concepts, I'd been thinking about the dynamic that goes on when you have a credible ground force and a credible air force overhead working in coordination. And so when I went to Fort Drum, I think I was regarded as pretty successful. Never in combat. I retired before 9/11, but in our war games, there was a point where they had to, for the big warfighter exercise / inspection, they had to pause the game for 2 hours to reset the simulation because of the damage I had created by understanding how to use air and ground offensively together. I call it the air to ground dynamic. That is, when you have first of all, what are the great advantages of blitzkrieg? Speed, mass, firepower. Well, when the enemy is able to use blitzkrieg style warfare against your blitzkrieg, you're going to have a mass on mass slugfest. But from a pilot's point of view, when the enemy is massed and moving fast, well, as one of my buddies put it, it's Cass City. It's a target-rich environment. And so what happens is the enemy has to either suffer the punishment as well as they can, or they have to slow down, immobilize, and disperse, right? Well, now you've got them taking away their two greatest advantages of blitzkrieg, and your ground force is still able to take full advantage of those blitzkrieg advantages. And so the ground forces are going to be ripping through the enemy's immobilized and dispersed ground forces like tissue paper. What's the enemy ground commander going to do? I can't put up with this. I've got to mass and I've got to move. I've got to hit hard. Well, now that our ground commander backs off and the A-10s come in and you just go back and forth. So I think and one of the things to back up Nate's point of view, I agree. I think the Air Force and to some extent the Army have come to see CAS as defensive. And here's one of the big mysteries. A big part of Danger Close was explaining how we saw this dynamic working in Afghanistan. Conan was part of the story in one of those episodes, and how we saw it again in the invasion of Iraq. There was an episode where the Fifth Corps commander realized that Saddam had immobilized and dispersed his armored forces, waiting for the right moment to mass and hit Third ID hard, and so he initiated what became known as the Battle of Five Simultaneous Attacks. Third ID was going in one direction, hitting one city. 101st was going in another direction, hitting another city. And so essentially what this was intended to do was to force Saddam to concentrate his troops, mass his armor, and start moving fast to hit those guys. And then Cass came in and just decimated them.
Yeah.
Perfect example. Ground forces were the supporting element, supporting the air offensive, which was the supported element in that category. Incredibly offensive. And you know what? Just to close this out, I kind of thought after that came out, somebody was going to call and say, hey, Steve, tell us more about this air-ground dynamic and offensive use of CAS. Well, like General Half-Track in the old Beetle Bailey comic strip sat there waiting for the Pentagon to call, and nobody called.
Well, and so you also, okay, one, I think that, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, you take the politics out of it and you just look at the invasion and you look at it as a masterclass of the integration of air and ground forces.
Absolutely.
Right? Not only third ID, but you have, the Rangers running into some hot shit at Haditha Dam and, 36 plus hours of constant CAS. And all of a sudden you have a Ranger battalion defeating a brigade of Republican Guard. And then you have, fourth ID was unable to enter through Turkey on the north side of Iraq. So what did we do? We sent in 12 ODAs to raise 6,000 guerrillas to go fight 2 divisions of Republican Guard. And they decimated them, right? 6,000 guerrillas, 12 ODAs, and a competent Air Force that's integrating air into the ground scheme of maneuver. When else has that been done? Right. So that's what competent CAS, offensive CAS looks like. But when the Air Force thinks defensive, you think, okay, if you ask me, you're my ground commander, I'm your JTAC, and you're like, hey, what can we do with F-35s? I'm like, well, if we want to get offensive, I'm going to use it as an integrator, right? And we are going to need a bunch of bombers. Give me some bombers, some F-15Es, and that F-35, I'm going to use that to help me target. It's not going to be my main weapons platform. He's going to be a guy because of his tech suite who can help pass along data for me. In a defensive scenario, I'm like, okay, cool. Maybe I can have an F-35 for 30 minutes, and I'm going to have to be very picky with his bombs because he doesn't have many. He's not going to want to get low to use his gun. Who knows if the thing even works? And I can only be defensive with it, right? If you just give me F-35, that's something for us to break contact. That's not something for us to be like, okay, we're going to go conquer this fight because we have this huge enabler, right? That's just not what that is.
If I could, Nate, I'd rather you tell the story. But one of the greatest examples of offensive air to ground, offensive air enabling exploiting the ground maneuver is O.P. Wayland in Patton's race across France, northern France. You were talking about it a while ago in one of our other podcast sessions. So can you tell that story?
Sure, I'll give the brief version. It's one of my favorite stories. So Wayland had a great relationship. So Wayland is the Tactical Air Command commander aligned with General Patton. Those two share a command center. They're traveling together, which was at the time revolutionary for an air and ground commander to be out together in the field. So they were able to coordinate very effective offensive CAS. So when Patton is racing across the river to Paris, he does something that all of his subordinates think is insane. He doesn't send a division across the river to guard his flank. He puts that purely on Wayland and his Tactical Air Command. And they find a German division on the other side of the river and completely decimate that division so Patton can just keep moving. And it gets to the point where Patton sends a general over there to accept that German general's surrender. And he says, no, I'll surrender to the air commander. And so Wayland becomes the only commander in World War II, the only air commander to accept the surrender of a ground division. So that's a fun little story on how effective offensive CAS can be.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, a lot of times we would joke about, we need far side security. It's like, we got ISR for far side security. And that, theoretically was a thing, but no one ever liked actually hearing that as an answer.
Yeah,
How
maybe
you
with
watch the black side of
U-28s.
a
I don't know
target.
about an MQ-1 or MQ-9, but U-28, I'll take that.
Yeah, we were using MQ-9s, but I actually want to go to that next. One of the things that we're hearing a lot of, and we heard it back in the day, and I was actually an early proponent of it. I'm not sure how I feel about it now. Love to get y'all's thoughts. Actually using drones, ISR, like an MQ-9, as a CAS platform, because when you look at it, it's extremely low cost. You can fly them in from basically anywhere. They can go low and slow if you want them to. They've got tremendous loiter time, and you can load them up with enough Hellfire missiles to do some pretty good job. And you can make those big missiles, small missiles. You got some optionality there, and that was even without trying to build a dedicated drone for CAS. So would a drone be an effective replacement for the A-10? Because as a ground force commander, it actually checks a lot of blocks for me. There's a lot of convenience factors there. Conan, what do you think about this?
So I'll just say no right off the bat, unless and until we can develop one that can carry the same amount of munitions, right? And we don't have a drone right now that we can talk about that can carry what the A-10 can carry. One of the things we found in Afghanistan was we had to change our tactics on the fly. And during Op Medusa in summer and fall of 2006, there were a lot of foreign fighters, and they were obviously better trained than the locals, and they brought that with them. And so we would find that we would hit them, they would run into a tree line, and we'd lose them, right? So what we were doing is with the A-10, because of that loiter time, because of that ability to kind of park over the battle space, one would come in, would drop a bomb, hit the ground. They would run into the tree line. Two would already be circling up to come down the tree line with guns. They know they're not going to run back towards where the bomb went off, so they run out the back side of the forest, and one has already circled around with an airburst to smoke them. Is the tactic capable of being handed off to drones? Sure. But it's that selectable fusing and the ability to be able to carry the fight. If there were, if you took all the A-10s and turned them into drones, you still got to have somebody who understands how to fly them, right? Until Skynet takes over and we have the Terminators flying for us, there's still a person involved in the loop, and they need to understand the tactics. They need to understand how to change up on the fly. And I think A-10 pilots do that because they are slow, because they are the ones who stand there and are ready to take the punch in the face, where our other platforms are designed to jab and move. Yes, drones are less expensive, but how many more do we need to put to flood into? Is it a 4-ship? Is it a 6-ship? Because it's going to be a lot more than just a 2-ship.
Mm-hmm. So
you cannot put that gun on a drone, or we haven't yet that I know of. And that gun is absolutely. I'm telling you, buddy, the sound of freedom. The language of my people is.
Nothing sounds better in the morning than Bert. I will not argue the fact. I will not argue the fact. Yeah. But I like bacon, and sometimes I got to eat my vegetables. So just because I love it doesn't necessarily mean I can hold on to it. But well taken. So what lessons have we drawn? This is for the group. What lessons are we drawing from, war games over Taiwan, current conflict in Ukraine? We can look at what CAS has done with the global war on terror. Obviously, great power competition is different than that. We can look back to other areas of great power competition, namely World War II, for examples. But what does CAS need to look like for what we're getting ready to deter with Russia and China? And since we apparently have $1.5 trillion to spend on our next defense budget, money is no longer an object. So I don't know why we're retiring the A-10 anyway, but that's for mental cognizance. I'm just going to ignore that fact for now. But what does CAS need to look like?
Let me jump on that dollar figure, because to upgrade the A-10s to, as Nate was saying, the A-10 of 2030, we're talking about $4.5 billion over 5 years. That's a rounding error, right? That's people just don't.
It's not even, doesn't even show up in the budget.
Exactly, right. So it's nothing. So keeping those while we develop that next generation CAS platform seems to me like the best plan, and I think that's why Congress keeps stepping in, right? because what the Air Force leadership seems to have forgotten is you don't abandon the guys on the ground for PowerPoint slides about future wars that may never come, right? It's great to we're gonna invent the best new toaster, and it's gonna toast the bread before you even put it in there. But I'm gonna go with the old way, right? Um, the reality is that yes, we have all that money. Let's test something. Let's develop something. The technology of the A-10, it was developed in the 70s. Really, technology that they put into that was probably coming out of the 60s. So we're looking at already 60-year-old technology. Uh, let's take some of that 1.5. Let's do that. But unless and until, let's not just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, let's get a new baby too. That doesn't make any sense.
Steve.
Yeah. Again, here's the military historian's point of view. Okay. I just, by the way, recently finished reading, Reconsidering the American Way of War. Ever since Russell Wagley came out with his famous The American Way of War, it's been a hotly contested issue. And one of the things that this guy, I can't recall his name off the top of my head, but one of the things he points out is that starting in the 90s, and I can say I saw that because that's when I was in the Pentagon, we started getting one bright new idea after another, and there were all these, they were talking about the RMA, Revolution in Military Affairs, and I tell you what, we were joking in the Pentagon that every new idea was some major counting on this new idea and his briefing to get him promoted. And so my point is we have become too focused on what the British would call being too clever by half. We think we're so smart that we're going to come up with some brilliant forward thinking over the horizon concept, and we'll get there before the time even arrives. Well, I'm sorry, I'm old school. I have seen so many. I mean, I'm always bringing up with these guys Julius Caesar or Napoleon or something like that. I have heard so many times in the past where military theorists were predicting that the next war is not going to be anything like the last war. Of course, a lot of times they're saying just the opposite. But the times that they have said the way we fought in the past is obsolete and war will never be fought like that again. Sorry, the next war comes. And my point is, you are going to get a grunt on grunt battle. I think a lot of these, the denial of entry, we're going to have to fight from afar, just imagines that somehow or another, it's never going to come down to the guy on the ground closing in and contesting with the other guys on the ground. And that's not a reality. That is going to happen. And we need to have, as an Air Force, as Air Force thinkers, we need to have something to help those guys on the ground when that inevitably happens.
Yeah, and Steve, I just want to touch on that, right? So I mentioned earlier that I've written a book on crisis leadership. Well, in crisis leadership, you don't throw away a proven solution for one that theoretically looks good on paper, right? You maintain your capability while you validate the new replacement under real world conditions. And I would offer that the Pentagon tried to pass off that they had done that with the F-35, and we talked about that ad nauseum. I'm not so wed to the A-10 that I'm not ready to see something else, but we don't have anything else. So unless and until that happens, hey, dude, on the ground, oh, wait, that's me because I'm next to you because I'm the JTAC next to you. Yeah, I want something that can hang out. And, we had some quick fights. We had some long fights. And when they were long and we had the opportunity to have a platform overhead, and we can go, probably develop a whole nother talking point on using multiple platforms and relays and things like that. But, me passing it to some ISR that has just a couple of Hellfires on it, which are usually sleeved, not great out in the open area. There's just employment tactics, and it becomes, a bigger discussion about what are we actually going to put into place. Let's take some of that 1.5 trillion. Let's figure it out, right? And while we're figuring it out, let's keep the A-10 at a fraction of the cost. I mean, an infinitely small fraction, and let's protect the warfighter. And oh, by the way, Steve, to your point, we didn't we're never going to use CAS again, right? That's why the F4 was built with no
See,
gun,
fine,
right? Rockets
great.
they're going to be great and solve all the problems. We stumble over the same mistakes over and over. Let's not do it again. That's all I'm getting at.
There's
1945, we're never going to do CAS again.
Yeah.
1953, we're never going to do CAS again. 1973, we're never going to do CAS again. 1991, we're never going to do CAS again.
Yeah. There's one of the best books I ever read was This Kind of War. It's a history of the Korean War. I believe the author was T.E. Feinbach. I'm probably saying that last name wrong.
Yeah.
But a famous quote, I think it's from chapter 25, and I'll butcher it. But there's this great line in there. And of course, he's describing the Korean War. He's writing this in the 1960s. And everyone's talking about how nuclear weapons make old way of fighting obsolete and all this, that, and the other thing. And he I think he writes a quote that's the second part to Clausewitz's War is Continuation of Politics by Other Means. And we can see that with how hard Ukraine's fighting to stay alive despite fighting a technologically superior enemy in many respects. But Feinbach writes, you can fly over land forever, you can atomize it, pulverize it, turn it into dust. But if you want to keep it for civilization, you must do this the way the Roman legions did, by putting your young men in the mud. And as long as people want to fight over something, they're going to fight over it till it's bare knuckles and butcher knives. And that's an innate part of human nature that you cannot technology your way out of. And we always think that because it's inconvenient for us, it'll be so inconvenient for somebody else that they'll just roll over and take it if we show up and are clever enough. And we never seem to learn that lesson.
Too clever by half.
Right. And like Steve said, one day we will have that grunt on grunt fight again. And the A-10 is a phenomenal close air support platform that allows our grunts to blow through their grunts, right? You want to win if you're going to fight a war, you want to end it fast. And right now the A-10 is a fantastic tool to help us occupy space with our army very quickly. That tool goes away, you lose a huge capability in ending that war fast and helping our grunts blow through their grunts. And that's one of the big takeaways here is that if you lose the A-10, you lose a phenomenal tool that does not have a replacement yet. One thing that we could get into, but would be a longer conversation, is one saving grace that the Army has is, this loitering munitions technology. But we see how that's going in Ukraine and Russia, right? Even with great loitering munitions technology, they're still in trenches, right? We don't want to put our guys in trenches. We want them blowing through and to move until their objective complete.
Yeah. One thing also, I think we ought to look at this from the grunt's point of view. I always took phenomenal pride in the confidence that we gave our Army brothers. When the Air Force announced they were gonna chloroform the A-10 ahead of schedule, I responded to a discussion on LinkedIn saying the Air Force just kicked every Army, every soldier, every Marine, and every Special Forces operator in the teeth. What does the A-10 mean? I think in an earlier interview with you, I mentioned a Tack Pee who told me that the sound of the A-10 gun was like the hand of God reaching down and saying, "Don't worry, I got you." What does the A-10 mean to the soldier? We're asking our young men to go into the mud and to engage an equally determined enemy, usually outnumbering us. And we have to give him some confidence. And I honestly think that there's nothing that gives a soldier or a Marine or a special operator more confidence than knowing that A-10s are overhead.
Well said. One final question for the group. Please, Conan.
No, I don't. I would rather hear your question.
Okay. Yeah, I know we're a little over time. I want to be respectful of everyone's plans for the day.
It seems like a snowstorm. I have some place to get to.
I got to go outside and shovel. But it seems like a lot of this, we can talk about the platform, we can talk about the tactics, we can talk about this, that, and the other thing. But it really seems to be an issue of priorities. The Army has its priorities. The Air Force has its own priorities. And it almost feels like there was this corrupt bargain struck after World War II when they were divvying up mission sets, and the Army let the Air Force take the close air support mission, and CAS became something that the Air Force was required to provide and that the Army was not allowed to provide for itself, which is why the Army can get a rotary-wing aircraft, but not a fixed-wing aircraft. Do you think that was a mistake? Do you think that one of the lessons we needed to draw is we need to divest the close air support mission set from the Air Force and just hand that to the Army?
If I could jump in on this, and I apologize if you other guys wanted to jump in, but I had a rude awakening when I showed up at Fort Drum. And I know I've told these guys about it. There was this epic battle in the tank, the Joint Chiefs of Staff briefing room, where Curtis LeMay and Wheeler, I can't remember his first name, Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, were just going at it about the Air Force won't do CAS like the Army wants it, and that's why the Army needs helicopters to do CAS. And LeMay challenged Wheeler to a duel, me and my airplane and you and your helicopter, and we'll see who does better. Well, okay. What I learned when I showed up at Fort Drum was, at least in the mind of 10th Mountain Division, and as I understood, this was Army, right out of the Army rule book. Helicopters do not do CAS. Helicopters are maneuver units, co-equal in your maneuver scheme with armor and infantry. I'm sorry. We did give the Army helicopters so that they could do CAS. And what did the Army do with it? You want us to give another CAS asset to the Army, trusting that they're going to keep it for CAS? I'm sorry. They don't have a good track record. They're 0 for 1.
Can I jump in on that real
Yep,
quick?
please.
Okay, so the just give it to the Army kind of mindset fundamentally misunderstands 76 years of this inter-service agreements, right? We talked about after World War II, that Key West agreement, right? That established the Air Force's responsibility for close air support to the Army. Let's go with the Pace-Finletter Memorandum in 1952. Again, these are after wars, right? Just like Steve was saying, that removed weight restrictions on the Army helicopters so that they could develop things like the Apache. But it did impose a 5,000-pound weight limit on Army fixed-wing aircraft. And then you got the Johnson-McConnell Agreement in '66, where they further ceded their heavy airlift to the Air Force from the Army. And so they do have some fixed wing. We know that, right? They've got their VIP jets. They've got some C-12s, et cetera, et cetera. But let's talk about the fact that the Apache, while very capable, is not a replacement for CAS. I mean, how many would you have to fly to carry the proper amount of ordnance? That's a question. They're not as survivable, right? Even though American Apache pilots will fly low and get in the mix, our NATO buddies like to be up high where they feel they're more survivable, and they may be right. But let's move on to the next one real quick. The JTAC training infrastructure problem. So even if we just gave the Army the A-10s, like we tried to do in 1994, when the Chief of Staff of the Air Force is General Merrill McPeak, he offered to transfer both the A-10 and the CAS mission to the Army and the Marines and retire the Warthog. We're done, right? Well, the Army declined. Why? Because they understood they lacked the infrastructure. And I'm going to go back to the infrastructure in just a second. And they don't have the training pipeline, and they don't have the institutional expertise to execute the mission. And that was 30 years ago. Let's talk about what they're looking at today. A JTAC, Special Warfare Prep course, is 8 weeks in Lackland. You can move it wherever the Army wants to. TAC Pee selection is another week. TAC Pee apprentice course is 6 months at Herbert Field. Then you got the Joint Firepower course at Nellis. Then you got SEER school, you got basic airborne, and then you have advanced skills training, which is another 6 months. All told, you're closing in on a 2-year pipeline, 1.5 to 2 years, costing $30,000+ per candidate. And right now you've got on active duty about 800 TAC Ps, more in the Guard. I think there's probably about half that in the Guard. And those are primarily supporting the conventional units. Primarily supporting the soft units are the combat controllers, of which there's only about 275 of those. Now, there are some TAC Ps that have a soft role, specifically to support the Rangers mostly, but also some of the ODAs. And then the Marines have their own tax, and the Navy SEALs have their tax as well. So if the Army tried to stand it up, it would require building parallel training infrastructure, because you can't, again, although let's get rid of the A-10, let's close it down, we have no replacement. We wouldn't just shut down the Air Force training pipeline while the Army built theirs, right? There would be parallel training pipelines, and it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Somebody mentioned it earlier about priorities. I don't think this is a priority to the Army to pick up as a viable career field. It's always been an additional duty. If you look at a Green Beret who is JTAC qualified, it's an additional duty. It's usually the weapons sergeant. You look at the guys, down in conventional, they're usually joint firepower observers. If they ever actually get to become a JTAC, they do not have the ability to maintain the currency. It takes significant support from their command, and that just isn't in place right now.
So, Conan, you mentioned the Key West Agreement, and I was wondering if that would come up. So, for your listeners, Scott, the Key West Agreement is a very important meeting that happened post-World War II that kind of set the military on the path that it's on. We still have, the ghosts of the Key West Agreement following us to this day, for good or for bad. And the Air Force's main argument in retaining close air support in the Key West Agreement is exactly what Conan's talking about. The vocabulary would be duplication of effort. Because once the Army gets its foot in the door, we're like, okay, you have the A-10 and you have CAS. But what that turns into is an ever-expanding tactical Air Force. Eventually, the Army will have its own tactical Air Force if you give them CAS. Because now, okay, well, we have CAS, we have the A-10. Well, wait a second, the A-10 can go ahead and do SCAR too. It can go ahead and do AI. So now you have the Army kind of doing its own thing in CAS, SCAR, air interdiction, and they're moving further and further beyond the FLOT. And now you have extreme command and control issues, right? Because you're still going to need that Air Force liaison with the Army, i.e. the TACP, to coordinate their fires with the Air Force side of the house, right? So now you have a kind of a decentralized command and control of the airspace that gets incredibly complicated, incredibly messy, introducing the risk for a lot more friendly fire. Now, I do not think that we should ever go back on that. I don't think the Army should ever control fixed wing close air support. I think if we had to give the A-10 to anyone, it would be the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps does actually make sense as a home for the A-10 to me. I don't see many great arguments as to why they shouldn't. But the Army, absolutely not, because that just turns into a tactical Air Force. And then you have a huge duplication of effort between the Air Force and the Army. And that's, funding's always a thing.
So I'm listening to this, and I'm swapping out some words in my head, and it really just sounds like you're making a great argument for the Army to absorb the Marine Corps too. Got it.
No,
all right.
You did not hear us say that. I've already antagonized the entire Army aviation community with my desecration of Army attack helicopters. I don't want to get the Marines after me.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to come and speak. Hopefully somebody pulls their head out of their ass and we have a viable solution to either replace or upgrade the A-10 in the future, because, war is not going anywhere, and neither is the need for CAS. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Appreciate you coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Scott. Thanks.
Bye, guys.